The morning fog rises slowly from the Moscow River in the winter of 1849, carrying with it the metallic tang of stone dust and fresh mortar. Beneath the pale December sky, the air trembles with the rhythm of hammers against marble, the scraping of scaffolding, the muffled shouts of foremen echoing across courtyards where snow cannot settle because the ground beneath radiates heat from furnaces burning day and night. Here, on Borovitsky Hill, where Ivan the Terrible once dreamed his terrible dreams, a new kind of dream takes shape. This one wears the face of imperial magnificence, dressed in white limestone and gold leaf, promising permanence in a world defined by impermanence. Yet even as the sunlight catches the freshly installed crosses atop 5 golden cupolas, casting reflections that dance across frozen puddles, another story unfolds in the shadows. It is a story written in broken backs and emptied treasuries, in supply chains stretching thousands of miles in the hands of craftsmen who will never walk the halls they are creating. The palace rising before the world's gaze is not merely stone and precious metal. It is a monument to extraction, to the transformation of human effort into architectural immortality. And like all such transformations, it demands payment that extends far beyond the initial construction. The Grand Kremlin Palace stands today as it stood then, 700 feet of façade facing the river, 3 stories tall but feeling taller because of the way it dominates the skyline, refusing to blend into the landscape, insisting instead that the landscape acknowledge it. The numbers alone suggest enormity. 700 rooms when first completed, over 125,000 square feet of interior space, 15 separate interconnected chambers for state functions, each named for a different military order, each designed to inspire awe and submission in equal measure. The St. George Hall stretches over 200 feet in length, its ceiling suspended nearly 60 feet above a floor of polished parquet, composed of 20 different species of wood, each piece cut and fitted by hand, arranged in geometric patterns that required mathematical precision and artistic vision operating simultaneously. The walls rise in creamy white, punctuated by columns of artificial marble, gilded capitals catching the light from 6 massive chandeliers, each weighing over a ton, each requiring its own system of cables and counterweights hidden in the ceiling structure, each needing periodic lowering for maintenance by teams of workers who must dismantle and clean thousands of individual crystal prisms. This is the space where czars received foreign ambassadors, where military honors were bestowed, where the visual language of power spoke without words. But visual language requires infrastructure. The visitor ascending the grand staircase in 1850 would have experienced the palace as pure theater. Red carpets flowing like rivers of blood down white marble steps, walls covered in patterned silk that shimmered with every movement, doorways framed in malachite and jasper, semi-precious stones shipped from the Ural Mountains 2,000 miles to the east, transported in crates packed with straw and sawdust, each crate requiring a team of oxen to move, each stone cut by craftsmen who spent years learning the unique properties of these materials, how they split, how they polished, how they caught and refracted light. The Vladimir Hall, dedicated to the Order of St. Vladimir, featured walls entirely covered in pink and white stucco, molded into elaborate reliefs, figures and garlands and medallions, every surface decorated, every corner demanding attention. The ceiling bore frescoes depicting the order's history, painted by artists imported from Italy and Germany, men who spent months lying on their backs on scaffolding platforms, painting with brushes made from specific animal hairs, mixing pigments ground from minerals that arrived in packets, labeled in languages most workers could not read. 15 fireplaces, each faced with different colored marble, each requiring a separate chimney flue, each needing daily cleaning and ash removal, each consuming approximately 200 pounds of wood per day during the heating season, which in Moscow extends from October through April, 7 months of constant burning. What the visitor did not see, could not see, was designed with equal precision. Beneath the parquet floors ran heating systems of revolutionary complexity for the time. The palace employed a combination of traditional stoves and newer hot air circulation systems, inspired by European innovations but adapted to Russian conditions, to the reality of winters where temperatures could plunge to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, where maintaining interior warmth was not a luxury but a requirement for the building's physical survival. Water freezing in pipes could crack stone. Rapid temperature fluctuations caused the precious parquet to warp and split. The heating system required a network of basement furnaces, tended by shifts of stokers working around the clock, men whose names appear in no official histories, but whose labor kept the palace viable. Each furnace consumed approximately half a ton of wood per day. With over 40 major heating sources, the palace burned through thousands of tons of fuel annually, fuel that had to be cut in forests, transported to the city, dried in storage facilities, cut again into manageable pieces, carried through service corridors by workers who moved through the building's hidden circulatory system like blood cells sustaining a living organism. Water posed an equally complex challenge. A building of this scale, hosting state functions for hundreds of guests, required water for kitchens, for washing, for the elaborate bathrooms created for the imperial family, for the cleaning of those 700 rooms. Moscow, in the mid-19th century, had no centralized water system. The palace relied initially on wells, and later on water pumped from the Moscow River, filtered through sand beds, stored in cisterns located in the basement, then pumped again through hand-operated systems to upper floors. The labor was continuous and invisible. Servants rose before dawn to begin pumping operations. Kitchen workers needed water heated in massive copper cauldrons over wood-fired stoves. Cleaning crews required fresh water brought to every floor in buckets, because the internal plumbing, while advanced for its time, could not deliver water to every location. The palace maintained a permanent staff of over 200 people simply to manage these basic operations, people who lived in cramped basement quarters, who worked 6 days a week, who earned wages sufficient to survive but never to escape the cycle of service. The man who commissioned this extraordinary edifice was Nicholas I, a figure whose complexity deserves examination beyond the simplified portraits history provides. Born in 1796, third son of Emperor Paul I, Nicholas never expected to rule. His childhood was marked by the chaos of the Napoleonic Wars, by the assassination of his father in a palace coup, by the constant awareness that his position depended on forces beyond his control. He received a military education, developed a personality characterized by rigid discipline, a belief that order could be imposed on chaos through will and system. When he ascended to the throne in 1825, following his brother Alexander's unexpected death, his reign began with the Decembrist Revolt, a military uprising suppressed with executions and exiles that haunted Nicholas for the remainder of his life. He saw himself as a father to Russia, stern but necessary, maintaining stability in a world that seemed perpetually on the verge of dissolution. The palace he commissioned was not mere vanity. It represented his vision of autocratic power made tangible, power that derived its legitimacy not from popular consent, but from historical continuity, from the visual and spatial assertion of permanence. Nicholas involved himself personally in the palace's planning. He reviewed architectural drawings with the attention of a military strategist, examining battlefield maps. He selected Konstantin Thon as chief architect, a man whose style embodied what would become known as Russian Byzantine revival, a conscious attempt to create a national architectural language that referenced Russia's Orthodox heritage while incorporating European classical elements. Nicholas understood that buildings communicate. The Grand Kremlin Palace needed to speak simultaneously to multiple audiences. To foreign visitors, it demonstrated that Russia belonged among Europe's great powers, that it possessed the wealth and technical sophistication to create monuments equal to any in Paris or Vienna. To the Russian nobility, it reinforced the Tsar's position at the apex of society, transforming the monarch's residence into sacred space. To the common people, who would never enter these halls, it stood as a distant symbol of national pride and unattainable grandeur. But Nicholas also understood cost. He demanded opulence, but he expected his architects and administrators to achieve it within budgetary constraints that were, given the ambition involved, nearly impossible to meet. Construction began officially in 1838 and continued for a decade, though preparatory work had started years earlier with the demolition of older Kremlin structures. The site itself posed challenges. Borovitsky Hill had been built upon for centuries. Medieval foundations lay beneath later construction. Archaeological remnants of wooden fortifications, of stone churches, of residential buildings dating back 500 years, all had to be cleared or incorporated. The ground was unstable in places, requiring deep foundations. Workers excavated by hand, using pickaxes and shovels, removing earth in wooden buckets, creating holes 30 feet deep in spots, pouring foundations of crushed stone and limestone mortar that took months to cure properly. The labor force fluctuated seasonally. During summer months, when agricultural labor was in high demand, workers became scarce and expensive. During winter, when peasants had less farm work, labor was more available, but working conditions became brutal. Mortar froze before it could set. Stone cracked under sudden temperature changes. Workers suffered frostbite, respiratory illnesses from constant exposure to stone dust and lime, injuries from falling materials, from scaffolding collapses, from the routine violence of large-scale construction. The stone itself came from quarries located dozens of miles from Moscow. White limestone, the primary building material, was extracted from quarries near the village of Myachkovo, where seams of appropriate quality had been exploited since medieval times. Each block required cutting by hand using iron wedges and saws, a process that could take hours for a single piece. Larger blocks weighed over a ton. Moving them from quarry to construction site required specially built wagons, teams of horses, roads maintained specifically for this traffic. During spring thaws, roads became impassable mud. Deliveries halted. Construction schedules slipped. Architects revised plans. Nicholas grew impatient. Administrative records from the period show constant tension between the Tsar's demands for rapid completion and the physical realities of logistics and weather. Letters between Thon and the minister of the imperial court detail shortages of skilled stonemasons, delays in marble deliveries from Carrara in Italy, problems with the production of gilded bronze for interior decoration, and always, endlessly, the problem of money. The initial budget approved by Nicholas was 12 million rubles, an astronomical sum representing approximately 1% of the empire's total annual revenue. By the time construction ended, actual expenditure had exceeded 18 million rubles. The overrun was not due to corruption alone, though corruption certainly occurred. The very nature of the project guaranteed escalating costs. As work progressed and the structure's scale became apparent, Nicholas demanded enhancements, more elaborate moldings, richer materials. The Vladimir Hall's original plans called for painted decoration, but Nicholas ordered semi-precious stone inlays instead. The St. George Hall was initially to have a flat painted ceiling, but the final design featured elaborate coffers with gilded rosettes. Each change cascaded through the budget. More materials meant more transport costs. More complex designs required more skilled craftsmen who commanded higher wages. Delays caused by weather or supply problems meant maintaining the workforce for longer periods. The project consumed resources that might have funded infrastructure improvements across the empire, schools, roads, agricultural development. Nicholas justified the expense as essential to national prestige, but within his own government, voices questioned whether prestige could be eaten during famines or used to build railways. The craftsmen who transformed architectural drawings into physical reality came from across Europe and the empire. Italian master masons arrived with techniques for working marble that Russian craftsmen had not yet mastered. German woodworkers brought expertise in parquetry and marquetry. Russian icon painters adapted their skills to secular ceiling frescoes. The social hierarchy on the construction site mirrored the broader society. At the top stood the architects and project managers, men educated in academies, fluent in multiple languages, moving in the same social circles as minor nobility. Below them came master craftsmen, skilled specialists whose labor commanded respect and reasonable compensation. Then came the journeymen, still learning their trades, working long hours for modest pay. At the bottom existed the unskilled laborers, peasants brought from surrounding villages, men and women who mixed mortar, carried materials, cleared debris, dug foundations, and whose labor was valued only slightly above that of beasts of burden. They worked 12 to 14-hour days during summer. They lived in temporary barracks constructed near the site, structures that were barely weatherproof, where disease spread quickly, where winter cold seeped through walls of thin planks. Records maintained by the construction office, preserved now in archives, document the human cost in bureaucratic language. In 1842, 17 workers died on site from various causes: accidents, illness, exposure. In 1843, 21 deaths. In 1844, the number rose to 28 as the pace of work intensified to meet Nicholas's deadlines. These numbers represent only deaths that occurred on Kremlin grounds. Workers who died in quarries extracting stone, in forests cutting timber, in transit during material shipments, in workshops producing bronze fittings or glass chandeliers. These deaths were recorded elsewhere or not recorded at all. The palace stands as a monument not only to imperial vision, but to the anonymous multitude whose bodies and years were consumed in its creation. Their names do not appear on commemorative plaques. No frescoes celebrate their contribution. Yet every square foot of parquet, every gilded capital, every piece of malachite inlay exists because someone, likely someone whose name we will never know, performed labor that was unrecognized except as an expense line in an accounting ledger. The palace's completion in 1849 triggered celebrations designed to demonstrate that the sacrifice had produced something transcendent. Nicholas hosted a reception in the St. George Hall for over 5,000 guests, an event that required months of planning that tested the building's systems to their limits. Kitchens operated continuously for 2 days preparing food. Wine cellars stocked with shipments from France and Hungary emptied dozens of casks. The heating system strained to maintain comfortable temperatures despite constantly open doors. Service corridors became rivers of human movement, servants carrying trays, musicians transporting instruments, guards patrolling, officials coordinating. The event succeeded brilliantly as spectacle. Foreign ambassadors sent dispatches home describing the palace as equal to anything in Europe. Russian newspapers celebrated the achievement as evidence of national greatness, but within weeks, the reality of maintenance began to assert itself. The parquet floor in the St. George Hall showed scratches and scuff marks from the thousands of feet that had crossed it. Silk wall coverings had been damaged by guests brushing against them. One of the massive chandeliers had developed a fault in its suspension system, requiring immediate repair to prevent collapse. The palace had been born, and now it needed to be kept alive. The ongoing cost of operating the Grand Kremlin Palace quickly became apparent. The structure required a permanent staff larger than many small towns. Palace records from 1850 list over 300 full-time employees assigned specifically to the Grand Kremlin Palace, not counting guards, government officials who worked in office spaces, or the Tsar's personal servants. This staff included housekeepers, cleaners, stokers, porters, window washers, floor polishers, lamplighters and trimmers, kitchen workers, laundry workers, maintenance carpenters, plumbers, painters, upholsterers, and various specialists responsible for the care of precious objects. Each employee required wages, housing or housing allowances, food rations in some cases, and supervision. The annual personnel cost alone exceeded 200,000 rubles. Heating costs during winter months consumed another 150,000 rubles annually. Repairs and maintenance, repainting, replacing damaged fabric, fixing plumbing leaks, addressing structural settling, refinishing floors, and countless other tasks added another 100,000 rubles each year. The palace, even when not hosting major state functions, cost approximately 500,000 rubles annually to keep operational, a burden that fell entirely on the imperial treasury. Nicholas I did not live to see the full implications of what he had created. His reign ended in 1855 with his death during the Crimean War, a conflict that exposed the Russian Empire's military and economic weaknesses despite the grandeur of its palaces. His son, Alexander II, inherited both the palace and an empire in crisis. Alexander faced a fundamental question. Could Russia afford to maintain symbols of imperial magnificence while desperately needing resources for modernization? The answer he developed was complex. The palace could not be abandoned without appearing to abandon the prestige it represented. Yet its costs could not continue unchecked. Alexander initiated what might be termed efficiency measures. Staff numbers were gradually reduced through attrition. Instead of 300 employees, the palace operated with 250, then 200, with remaining workers expected to cover additional responsibilities. Heating costs were addressed by closing off sections of the palace that were not regularly used, focusing resources on the main ceremonial halls and the rooms actually occupied by the imperial family during their stays in Moscow. Maintenance was deferred where possible. Minor repairs that would have been addressed immediately under Nicholas were now postponed unless they threatened immediate damage. The palace's role shifted subtly under Alexander II. While still serving as the Moscow residence for state occasions, it became less central to imperial life. The Tsar spent more time in St. Petersburg, at the Winter Palace and other residences. The Grand Kremlin Palace entered a phase of partial dormancy, coming alive only for coronations, major religious celebrations, and important state visits. This pattern intensified under subsequent Tsars. The building remained symbolically crucial, but practically underutilized. Entire wings stood empty for months at a time. The elaborate heating systems were fired up only when specific events demanded it. The massive kitchen facilities operated at fraction of capacity. This created new problems. Buildings need use to remain healthy. Empty rooms develop issues that occupied rooms do not. Temperature fluctuations cause materials to expand and contract, weakening joints and seams. Lack of regular cleaning allows dust and moisture to accumulate, creating conditions for mold and pest infestation. The parquet floors, designed to be walked upon regularly, began to show problems from disuse. Wood dried out and cracked, sections developed gaps. What had been built to last for centuries was aging prematurely because the pattern of use anticipated by the builders had not materialized. By the 1880s, under Alexander III, discussions began within the imperial court administration about the palace's future. Documents from this period, preserved in the Russian state archives, reveal frank assessments of the building's challenges. One memorandum from 1886 notes that maintaining the palace in full operational readiness costs more than the Tsar spends annually on all other Moscow properties combined. Another document calculates that if sections of the palace were permanently closed and converted to archive storage or administrative offices, annual costs could be reduced by 1/3. There were even preliminary discussions about converting portions of the building into a museum, allowing controlled public access, though this idea was quickly dismissed as incompatible with the palace's continued use for state functions. The solution eventually implemented was a middle path. The palace would remain an active imperial residence, but its maintenance budget would be firmly capped. Repairs would be prioritized ruthlessly. Cosmetic work would be minimized. The goal was preservation, not perfection, keeping the building functional rather than maintaining it in pristine condition. The decision to reduce maintenance spending had consequences that compounded over time. By the early 20th century, the palace showed visible signs of neglect despite its continued symbolic importance. Paint flaked from walls in lesser-used rooms. Water damage appeared on ceilings where roof leaks had been imperfectly repaired. Some of the elaborate silk wall coverings had faded badly or developed tears that were patched rather than replaced. The heating systems, already aging, required increasingly frequent repairs as components wore out. The electrical lighting system installed in the 1890s was poorly integrated with the building's original design, with wires run along walls and through spaces in ways that created fire hazards. The palace had become what many great monuments become: too expensive to maintain properly, too symbolically important to abandon, trapped in a state of managed decline, masked by periodic superficial refreshments for important occasions. The revolution of 1917 transformed the palace's existence in ways more profound than any decision made by the Tsars. When the Bolsheviks seized power and moved the capital back to Moscow in 1918, the Kremlin became the seat of Soviet government. The Grand Kremlin Palace, symbol of imperial autocracy, presented an ideological problem. Its existence represented everything the revolution claimed to oppose. Serious proposals emerged to demolish it, to erase this monument to class oppression and replace it with something reflecting socialist values. What saved the palace was primarily practical rather than sentimental consideration. The building, whatever its origins, provided functional space at a moment when the new government desperately needed facilities for meetings, administration, and the projection of state power. The palace survived by being repurposed. The transformation was substantial and often brutal. The imperial apartments were converted into offices. The ceremonial halls became venues for Soviet congresses and meetings. Many of the religious symbols were removed or covered. Frescoes depicting Christian themes were painted over. Gilded eagles and other imperial emblems were stripped away. The palace's furnishings, the priceless furniture, artwork, tapestries, and decorative objects accumulated over decades, were scattered. Some pieces went to museums, others were sold abroad through secret channels to raise hard currency for the struggling Soviet state. Still others simply disappeared, stolen by individuals in the chaos, destroyed through carelessness, or lost in the general disruption. The building's physical fabric suffered during this transition. Revolutionary governments prioritized revolution over maintenance. Resources that might have gone to repairing plumbing or patching roofs instead funded the Civil War, industrial development, political campaigns. The palace during the 1920s endured conditions worse than any in its history. Heating was minimal due to fuel shortages. Water damage from leaking pipes and roofs expanded unchecked. Sections of the elaborate parquet floors were damaged beyond repair when heavy office furniture and equipment were dragged across them. The 1930s brought a different kind of crisis. Stalin's consolidation of power and his drive to modernize the Soviet Union created competing pressures on the palace. On one hand, Stalin appreciated the building's grandeur and its utility for demonstrating Soviet power to foreign visitors. The palace hosted receptions where diplomats and foreign delegations were shown evidence that the Soviet Union possessed cultural sophistication and historical depth. On the other hand, Stalin had no sentimental attachment to historical preservation when it conflicted with his vision. He approved plans that significantly altered the Kremlin complex, including demolishing several historic churches and monasteries within the walls. The Grand Kremlin Palace survived these purges of architecture partly because Stalin found it useful, and partly because the cost of demolition and replacement would have been prohibitive even by Soviet standards. But Stalin did authorize substantial interior modifications. The smaller ceremonial halls were combined and reconfigured to create the Supreme Soviet Meeting Chamber, work that required demolishing interior walls, removing original decorations, and installing a layout completely foreign to the building's original design. The Second World War tested the palace's physical survival. Moscow came under aerial bombardment in 1941. The Kremlin, as the symbolic and practical center of Soviet government, was a primary target. The palace was camouflaged with paint and coverings designed to make it blend with surrounding structures when viewed from above. Anti-aircraft batteries were positioned nearby. The building suffered some damage from near-miss bombs that shattered windows and caused structural vibrations that cracked plaster and loosened decorative elements. More significantly, the war years meant absolute neglect of maintenance. Every resource went to the war effort. The palace's heating system functioned minimally. Windows broken by bomb concussions were repaired with whatever materials were available, often simple boards or poor-quality glass. Water infiltration during this period caused damage that would take decades to fully address. When victory came in 1945, the palace stood, but it stood diminished, weathered, bearing scars visible and invisible. Post-war restoration began slowly, limited by the Soviet Union's broader reconstruction needs. Millions of people were homeless. Entire cities needed rebuilding. The Grand Kremlin Palace was low on the priority list for resources. Work that did occur focused on functionality rather than historical accuracy. Rooms were repaired to be usable as offices and meeting spaces, not to restore them to their original grandeur. This pragmatic approach meant that many original features lost during the revolutionary period, and war years were never replaced. The palace that emerged from the 1950s was functional, but architecturally compromised, a palimpsest, where different eras and purposes had overwritten each other, creating a structure whose external facade promised magnificence that the interior could only partially deliver. The St. George Hall retained its basic form and some original decoration, serving as the primary ceremonial space, but other halls had been irrevocably altered. The Alexander Hall and the Andreevsky Hall were combined into a single large space. Original wall decorations were covered with simpler Soviet-era finishes. The cost of operating the palace under Soviet rule remained substantial despite the reduced attention to historical preservation. The building still required heating, lighting, water, cleaning, and repairs. Staff numbers remained significant. By the 1960s, approximately 150 people worked in the palace in various capacities, from janitors to specialized craftsmen, maintaining the remaining decorative elements. Annual operating costs, translated into modern terms, ran to several $million. The Soviet government absorbed these costs without public accounting, treating them as part of the general state apparatus expenses. No line item in the Soviet budget identified the specific cost of maintaining the Grand Kremlin Palace, just as no line item calculated the cost of maintaining the Kremlin itself. This financial opacity masked the ongoing burden. Resources committed to maintaining symbols of state power were resources not available for housing, healthcare, or consumer goods, a trade-off the Soviet leadership made constantly but never acknowledged publicly. The palace entered a new phase in the 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Russian Federation inherited the building along with all the other Kremlin structures. The question of what to do with this inheritance sparked debate. Some argued for complete restoration to its imperial-era appearance, erasing Soviet modifications and returning the palace to its 1849 condition. This approach would honor the building's historical significance and could boost tourism. Others advocated preserving the Soviet-era modifications as part of the building's layered history, arguing that the palace's evolution reflected Russia's complex 20th century. The practical reality was that full restoration would cost hundreds of millions of dollars that the cash-strapped Russian government of the 1990s did not have. The compromise reached involved selective restoration, focused on the most significant ceremonial spaces, while accepting that complete historical recreation was economically impossible. The restoration work undertaken in the 1990s and 2000s revealed just how degraded the palace had become. When specialists began examining the St. George Hall in detail, they discovered that over 40% of the parquet floor was damaged beyond repair and required complete replacement. Finding craftsmen who could recreate the original patterns using period-appropriate techniques proved difficult. The skills required had nearly vanished during the Soviet era when such work was not valued. Master parquetry workers had to be trained specifically for this project, learning from historical drawings and the remaining original sections how to cut, fit, and finish the complex geometric patterns. The work took years. Each section of floor had to be carefully removed, cataloged, and either restored or recreated. The wood species used in the original floor included some that were no longer easily available, requiring sourcing from specialized suppliers across Europe. The cost of restoring just the floor of the St. George Hall exceeded $10 million. Similar challenges appeared throughout the restoration. The silk wall coverings in several halls were too degraded to save. Replacing them required finding manufacturers capable of producing fabric matching the original patterns and quality. French and Italian textile companies still possessed the archives and skills, but custom production of historically accurate silk damask was extraordinarily expensive, costing thousands of dollars per square meter. The alternative was modern reproduction fabric that approximated the original appearance but lacked historical authenticity. Decisions were made case by case, balancing historical fidelity against cost. In the most visible ceremonial spaces, authentic materials were used. In secondary spaces, reproductions were deemed acceptable. The gilding on capitals and moldings had dulled and flaked over time. Regilding required craftsmen skilled in applying gold leaf, a delicate process where sheets of gold, beaten to incredible thinness, are carefully applied to prepared surfaces using traditional adhesives and techniques. A single St. George Hall capital required approximately 2,000 individual leaves of gold and a week of skilled labor to regild properly. The modern Grand Kremlin Palace operates under conditions Nicholas Tharn could never have imagined. It functions simultaneously as a working government building, a museum space open to limited public tours, and a venue for state ceremonies. This triple role creates complex logistical and security requirements. The heating and cooling systems have been modernized with climate control technology designed to protect both the building's historical fabric and the people working inside. Maintaining stable temperature and humidity is essential for preserving the wooden floors, the silk walls, and the artwork. The climate control system installed in the early 2000s cost over $30 million and requires constant monitoring and adjustment. Specialized technicians work around the clock managing the systems, responding to sensor readings, adjusting airflow and temperature in different zones to account for varying usage patterns and external weather conditions. Security measures layer additional complexity and cost onto the palace's operations. Because the Kremlin remains the working residence and office of the Russian president, security is comprehensive and expensive. Access to the palace is strictly controlled. Even staff members with regular duties inside undergo background checks and carry special identification. The public tours that generate revenue are limited in scope and frequency. Visitors see only specific halls under carefully controlled conditions, following prescribed routes, prohibited from touching surfaces or straying from designated paths. Each tour requires security personnel, specialized guides trained in the palace's history and the management of groups, and coordination with the broader Kremlin security apparatus. The revenue from tourism, while significant, covers only a fraction of the palace's operating costs. Annual ticket sales and associated merchandise generate approximately $5 million. Annual operating costs, including staffing, utilities, security, and routine maintenance, exceed $50 million. The difference is made up from the Russian federal budget, a subsidy that continues the pattern established in the 19th century, where state resources sustain this monument regardless of its economic logic. Major conservation work continues to be necessary and expensive. In 2015, specialists discovered that water infiltration behind walls in the Vladimir Hall had created conditions for mold growth that threatened both the structural integrity of the wall and the health of people working in the building. Addressing the problem required opening walls, installing new waterproofing and drainage systems, removing and replacing damaged sections of decorative plasterwork, and repainting. The project took 8 months and cost over $4 million. In 2018, engineers determined that the suspension systems for the massive chandeliers in the St. George Hall had deteriorated to the point where they posed a collapse risk. Each chandelier had to be carefully lowered using specially designed equipment, disassembled, its thousands of crystal prisms cleaned and cataloged, the bronze framework inspected and repaired, the suspension cables and mechanisms replaced with modern equivalents, designed to carry the weight safely, and then the entire assembly reinstalled. The work on all 6 chandeliers cost $12 million and required closing the hall for over a year. These ongoing crises and expenditures raise fundamental questions about sustainability. Can any building of this scale and complexity be maintained indefinitely? The Grand Kremlin Palace requires constant intervention to prevent deterioration. Left unheated for a single Moscow winter, the building would suffer catastrophic damage. Pipes would freeze and burst, wood would contract and crack, moisture would infiltrate. Within a decade of abandonment, the palace would be a ruin. Its survival depends on uninterrupted care that costs millions of dollars annually and requires specialized knowledge and skills that exist in diminishing supply. The number of craftsmen capable of repairing parquet floors using traditional methods is smaller every year. The number who can work with gold leaf, who understand historical plasterwork techniques, who can restore antique silk textiles. These numbers shrink as older masters retire or die, and younger workers choose more economically viable careers. The palace faces a future where the expertise needed to maintain it may become unavailable at any cost. The Russian government's commitment to maintaining the palace reflects calculations that extend beyond economics into the realm of national identity and prestige. The Grand Kremlin Palace serves as a physical embodiment of Russian historical continuity, linking the present government to the imperial past in ways that support narratives of enduring power and cultural significance. State ceremonies held in the St. George Hall, broadcast on television, communicate messages about Russia's place in the world. Foreign leaders received in these opulent spaces are meant to be impressed, to understand that they are dealing with a nation that commands resources and possesses deep cultural roots. These symbolic functions have value that cannot be easily quantified, but that governments nonetheless take seriously. The palace justifies its cost not through revenue, but through the intangible return on investment that comes from prestige and the projection of power. Yet, the decision to maintain the palace at great expense also reveals what is not being funded. The $50 million spent annually operating the Grand Kremlin Palace could alternatively fund approximately 2,000 low-income housing units, or 20 rural schools, or healthcare for tens of thousands of people. These trade-offs exist whether acknowledged or not. Every ruble spent rebuilding a capital is a ruble not spent elsewhere. The palace represents a choice about priorities, a choice made repeatedly across decades and centuries, a choice that values monumentality and historical continuity over immediate material needs. This is neither inherently wrong nor inherently right. It is simply the reality of how societies allocate limited resources among competing demands. The palace endures because those making allocation decisions continue to value what it represents more than they value the alternative uses of those resources. The lives of people who work inside the palace today bear some similarities to those of their predecessors in the 19th century, though the specifics have changed. Modern cleaning staff work 8-hour shifts rather than 14-hour days. They receive regular wages, benefits, and legal protections. Yet the work itself remains demanding and largely invisible. Floors must still be cleaned by hand using techniques that protect the delicate surfaces. Dust must be removed from elaborate moldings with soft brushes. Windows, some of them 15 feet tall, must be washed carefully to avoid streaking or damaging frames. The workers who perform these tasks are professionals, yet they are also, in a sense, servants to the building. Their labor consumed in the maintenance of something greater than themselves, something that will outlast them. They enter through service doors, move through corridors the public never sees, and work in sections of the palace that are closed off. Their relationship to the palace mirrors that of the 19th century stokers and porters, separated by time and circumstance, but united by the fundamental dynamic where human labor sustains architectural ambition. The conservation specialists who manage the palace's long-term preservation occupy a different position but face their own challenges. These are highly educated professionals, often with advanced degrees in art history, chemistry, engineering, or specialized conservation disciplines. They approach the palace as a patient, requiring constant monitoring and intervention. They use sophisticated instruments to measure temperature, humidity, air quality, and structural movement. They analyze samples of materials to understand degradation processes and develop treatment strategies. Their work is driven by a philosophy that the palace must be preserved for future generations, that it is not merely a building, but a cultural treasure whose loss would be irreparable. This perspective is admirable and widely shared in the heritage conservation community. Yet it also commits future generations to continuing the expense and effort. The decision to preserve the palace today is simultaneously a decision to require preservation tomorrow and the day after and the decade after. The commitment is perpetual or it is nothing. Recent discussions in the Russian government and among heritage professionals have acknowledged that the current model may not be sustainable indefinitely. Several proposals have been advanced to reduce the financial burden. One suggests increased private sponsorship, allowing corporations or wealthy individuals to fund specific restoration projects in exchange for recognition and certain privileges. This approach has been used successfully at other heritage sites, but raises questions about commercialization and influence. Another proposal advocates for expanded tourism, increasing visitor access and ticket prices to generate more revenue. This faces opposition from security services concerned about protecting the working government areas, and from conservationists worried that increased foot traffic will accelerate wear on floors and other surfaces. A third approach involves seeking UNESCO World Heritage status for the Kremlin complex, which could unlock international funding and expertise, but would also subject the site to international oversight and standards that might conflict with Russian governmental priorities. None of these proposals solves the fundamental problem. The Grand Kremlin Palace costs more to maintain than it can ever generate in revenue. It will always require subsidy. The question is not whether to subsidize it, but how much subsidy can be sustained and for how long. Economic downturns affect cultural budgets. Political changes alter priorities. The palace's future depends on decisions not yet made by people not yet in positions to make them. This uncertainty is not unique to the Grand Kremlin Palace. It characterizes virtually all major historical monuments. They survive not through inevitable momentum, but through continuous choices to continue supporting them despite the costs and alternative uses of resources. The palace, in its current state, represents layers of decision, compromise, and adaptation accumulated across nearly 2 centuries. The building Nicholas I inaugurated in 1849 was altered by his successors, repurposed by revolutionaries, damaged by war, partially restored by Soviets, and further restored by the Russian Federation. Each intervention was shaped by the constraints and priorities of its moment. The result is not a pure expression of any single vision, but a palimpsest, a structure that contains within itself the history of its survival. Walking through the St. George Hall today, a visitor experiences simultaneously the imperial grandeur of the mid-19th century, the Soviet modifications that altered but did not destroy that grandeur, and the modern restoration efforts that have attempted to recover something of what was lost while acknowledging what cannot be recovered. This layered quality gives the palace a complex authenticity. It is genuinely old, genuinely significant, but also genuinely changed, genuinely compromised. The central question posed at the beginning of this inquiry can now be answered with specificity. Who truly paid for the Grand Kremlin Palace? The initial cost was borne by the Russian imperial treasury, which derived its resources from taxation of peasants, customs duties, and state monopolies on certain goods. The laborers who built it paid with their bodies and years, receiving wages that barely sustained them while their work created value they could never access. The ongoing costs have been paid by successive governments drawing on state budgets, which means ultimately by taxpayers and by those who went without services that might have been funded with the resources instead committed to maintaining the palace. The cost includes not only money, but opportunity cost, what was not done because the palace consumed resources. It includes the human cost, the lives shortened by dangerous labor, the families disrupted by the absence of workers, the craftsmen whose skills were valued only as means to an end. What does it cost to keep the palace alive today? Approximately $50 million annually in direct operating expenses, tens of millions more in periodic major restoration projects, the employment of hundreds of people in specialized roles, the allocation of security resources that protect the building along with protecting government functions, the ongoing commitment to training new generations of conservation specialists and craftsmen, the political capital spent justifying these expenditures against competing demands. The cost is material and symbolic, financial and cultural. It is paid continuously and will need to be paid as long as the palace endures. The broader insight this history offers is that monumentality is not a one-time achievement, but a continuous process. Buildings do not survive because they are beautiful or significant. They survive because people and institutions make ongoing decisions to maintain them despite the costs. The Grand Kremlin Palace stands today not as an inevitable outcome of its historical importance, but as the result of countless unglamorous choices about budget allocations, maintenance schedules, and conservation priorities. Its gold leaf and marble are sustained by boilers and pumps, by cleaning schedules and security protocols, by the labor of people whose names will never be as famous as the building they serve. The palace's future is not guaranteed by its past. It depends on whether future governments and societies continue to value what it represents enough to continue paying what it costs. This dynamic applies not only to buildings, but to all forms of cultural heritage and collective endeavor. Great achievements, whether architectural, artistic, or institutional, require not only the vision and effort to create them, but the sustained commitment to maintain them. Museums need constant climate control and conservation. Libraries require preservation work and cataloging. Universities need endowments and ongoing investment. Democratic institutions require citizens willing to participate, despite the effort and compromise involved. The pattern is consistent. Creation is dramatic and visible. Maintenance is prosaic and often invisible. But maintenance is what determines whether creation endures or crumbles. The Grand Kremlin Palace teaches that beauty is not self-sustaining. Grandeur requires infrastructure. Permanence demands constant intervention. The building's magnificent facade depends on networks of heating pipes, drainage systems, electrical wiring, and the daily labor of cleaning crews. The ceremonial halls where state business occurs are possible only because workers in basements tend boilers, because conservators monitor humidity levels, because security staff control access, because budgets allocate millions to operations that generate no direct return. The palace survives not despite this infrastructure, but through it. The visible and the invisible are interdependent, and acknowledging that interdependence is essential to understanding how human achievements persist across time. The palace stands today on Borovitsky Hill, as it has stood for over a century and a half, its white limestone facade catching the morning light, its golden cupolas visible from across the Moscow River. To the visitor viewing from a distance, it appears timeless and inevitable, a permanent feature of the landscape. But closer examination reveals the truth. The building is maintained every day by people and systems that work continuously to prevent the decay that would otherwise be inevitable. The palace is not timeless. It is time-bound, aging like any organism, kept alive through intervention. It is not inevitable. It exists because of choices, past and present, to commit resources to its preservation. Understanding this transforms how we see all monuments. They are not gifts from the past, but responsibilities inherited, obligations accepted, requiring payment that never ends as long as we choose to keep them standing. What monuments in your own life or community appear permanent and self-sustaining, and what invisible labor and cost actually keeps them alive?